Operation Mincemeat, a bizarre, complex, and macabre story that nonetheless contributed to the saving of lives during the Second World War. Watch and listen as an odd idea from the corkscrew mind of a British intelligence officer evolves into a successful deception operation carefully crafted to save Allied lives during the invasion of Sicily. This presentation was created and narrated by Blake Douglas for Professor Maniates' History 216 on April 5th, 2025. Before we get into the details of Operation Mincemeat, we should go over the background context and set the stage. We need to understand where we are in the war and what is going on. Well, the time that this story takes place is from late 1942 through mid-1943. These are trying times. The balance of power is changing, and the war's momentum is slowly shifting from the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, to the Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. In the Pacific theater, the Allies won a victory at Midway in early June, severely damaging the Japanese fleet. This was a major turning point and enabled the first major offensive against the Japanese at Guadalcanal in August of 1942. These were important battles that helped to decide the fate of the Pacific. Meanwhile, in the European theater, which comes more into this story, the Battle of Stalingrad occurred throughout 1942 and 1943. As Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, faltered, the tide finally turned in favor of the Red Army. At that point, as the Soviet Union expended vast amounts of men and resources pushing toward Berlin from the east, Stalin urged his Western allies to begin their own offensive on mainland Europe. After a successful invasion of North Africa, called Operation Torch, the Allies finally began planning an attack on the Axis foothold in what had become known as Hitler's Fortress Europe. At Churchill's urging, the Allies began preparations for a strike at the soft underbelly of Hitler's Fortress Europe. This so-called disemboweling strike would come through Italy, Germany's ally to the south in mainland Europe, and also, as the Allies thought, a weak spot where forces could strike north through Italy into Central Europe and German-occupied territory. You can follow this on the pictured map, with Italy in the yellow and German-held lands in the darker brown. The Allies planned an amphibious invasion into the island of Sicily off Italy's southern coast. They considered it the most opportune target, which would enable them to strike further into mainland Italy. They codenamed this invasion Operation Husky. With Sicily as the target, Allied troops began to be moved in preparation for the eventual assault. Aerial strikes against enemy air bases on the island began as well. These measures seemed to suggest that Sicily was a likely target, making the Axis leaders, especially Mussolini, suspicious that an attack against Sicily was imminent. The Allies began a series of deceptive measures called Operation Barclay, which were intended to paint Greece as the target rather than Sicily. These were small, strategic things like troop movements, small raids, and other fake preparations, rather than the major piece of deception that Operation Mincemeat later entailed. Speaking of the Operation Mincemeat deception, we now get into the events that inspired that plan, of which there are two major ones. The first of these events occurred on September 25, 1942. On that day, a British Catalina seaplane, like the one pictured in the background, crashed in the waters surrounding Spain. A courier aboard the plane carried documents that referred to the date of the planned North African invasion. The body and documents were recovered by Spanish authorities and passed to the Germans. They were fortunately overlooked by higher authorities in the German hierarchy, and the invasion was not affected. But it became clear that the Spanish government could be trusted to hand over documents to the Germans. This was, as we will see, a vital component of the eventual Mincemeat plan. Another event also contributed to the inception of the Mincemeat plan, from the long-past days of World War I. It was called the Haversack Ruse. In 1917, a British general named Edmund Allenby attacked the Ottomans in Beersheba, modern-day Israel. After several unsuccessful attacks, Allenby wanted to suggest an attack on the nearby city of Gaza. He assigned Major Richard Meinertzhagen to do so. Meinertzhagen drew up fake documents suggesting such an attack and put them in a haversack, a small, single-strap backpack used by the military, as seen on the right there. He added other items like letters and personal effects to contribute to the deception. He then rode out toward the enemy lines. Once he was seen and fired upon, he dropped the haversack and then fled. After planting other false information to spread the word that important documents were missing, the enemy fell for the ruse and moved forces from Beersheba to Gaza, contributing to a successful attack for General Allenby's forces against the city of Beersheba. Neither of these two events might seem like much when taken alone, but when considered together, they suggested the beginnings of a plan to a British intelligence officer named Charles Cholmondeley. We'll get to more on him later. Cholmondeley came up with the idea that a corpse dressed in military uniform could be dropped in the sea off the Spanish coast. This corpse would carry false documents that the Spanish government could be trusted to pass along to the Germans. The plan had the advantage of increasing the credibility of the documents due to the weight of a human life being attached. It also ensured that the double agent, as he was called, could not be bought, tortured, tricked, or otherwise made to reveal a deception, because he was already dead. The idea, originally and rather uncreatively called Operation Trojan Horse, was presented to the 20 Committee, a department of MI5 in charge of feeding the enemy false information. The committee's chairman, a man by the name of John Masterman, was not opposed to the idea and assigned a representative from the Naval Department to help. That naval representative was named Ewan Montague and soon became an important part of the small team that made Mincemeat possible. Before we get into the details of the Trojan Horse operation, we should talk about the key players involved in the plan. Firstly, Charles Cholmondeley was the one who originally produced the plan. At 6'4", with a gangly frame, glasses, and a prominent mustache, his peculiar appearance was surpassed only by the peculiarities of his corkscrew mind, as those who worked with him described it. Motivated by both a longing for adventure and a desire to fight for his country, he had joined the Royal Air Force. However, due to his physical stature and his imperfect eyesight, he was consigned to a desk job. Due largely to his peculiar mind, Cholmondeley was soon after recruited by MI5, serving the role of an ideas man. Although intelligent, his ideas were often too peculiar and odd to be of real merit. However, the occasional gem, like the mincemeat deception, achieved great success. Ewan Montague, the naval representative assigned to help Cholmondeley, possessed a mind as intelligent, if not as odd, as that of Charles Cholmondeley. Montague was born into wealth, the son of a successful Jewish banking family. He was educated at Harvard and Cambridge as a lawyer, but joined naval intelligence at the beginning of the Second World War, wanting to fight for his country in whatever way he could. During the war, he ran a small intelligence section under naval authority that worked, in part, with ultra-intelligence intercepted from the German Enigma machines. He was assigned to work with Cholmondeley on the Trojan Horse project and, due to his intelligence and attention to detail, was instrumental in the project's completion. The third person involved in Operation Mincemeat contributed nothing to the operation while he was alive. After his death, however, the man named Glendower Michael became the most important part of the plan. Glendower Michael was born in 1909 to a family of coal miners in a small Welsh village called Aberbargoed. His life was a difficult one, plagued by poverty and sickness. After his parents both died, he became a traveling laborer, abandoned by his siblings and half-siblings during the difficult years of the Great Depression. He eventually found his way to London during the war years, and on January 24, 1943, he ingested rat poison, either by attempted suicide or by accident, as rat poison was often spread on crusts of bread, and he might have accidentally eaten a poison crust on accident while starving. Regardless of the reason, he died of phosphorus poisoning 2 days later. Michael had no relatives or friends who cared enough to take notice of his death, making him the perfect candidate. No one would notice if his body went missing. Montague and Chumley had previously made a connection with a local London coroner named Bentley Purchase, giving him only enough information to confirm that he would be on the lookout for a corpse that would not be missed by any family or friends, which would then be used, at great need, for the service of the country. When Glendower Michael's body came into Purchase's care, he immediately contacted Montague. After a brief examination of the body, Montague and Chumley called in Bernard Spilsbury, the leading pathologist in Britain at the time, and pictured on the right. Spilsbury, whose once considerable abilities were beginning to wane, fed his ego while reassuring Montague and Chumley that there was no pathologist in Spain that had the skill necessary to tell whether the victim had drowned or not. As we shall later see, his ego-driven assurance would nearly doom the operation. Deciding the body would suffice, Montague and Chumley had the corpse moved to an extra-cold refrigerator, which could be set at 39 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature which would slow the decay process, but not be so cold as to freeze the body, which would damage soft tissues and would be very evident to even the most amateur pathologist. After deciding Glendower Michael's body would be suitable, Montague and Chumley submitted another draft of the Trojan Horse Plan to the 20 Committee. They went into more detail, saying the body would be dropped from a plane to wash ashore on the Spanish coast. Faked documents attached to the body would suggest an attack on the Balkans and Sardinia, both of which you can see on the map there, while painting Sicily as the cover target. Marking Sicily as the cover target was an important inclusion because it ensured that, if the enemy learned of any actual preparations for the invasion of Sicily, they would assume they were deception operations, like the real Operation Barclay, and ignore them. The obvious name, Trojan Horse, was abandoned in favor of the somewhat more macabre and fitting Operation Mincemeat. If this ruse was to prove successful, the corpse of Glendower Michael would need a believable identity that the German and Spanish intelligence officers would buy. Glendower Michael would not fit the bill, so Chumley and Montague began creating a character that suited their needs. They had many factors to consider. His rank, service branch, and abilities had to fit someone who would be trusted and needed as a courier. His age, habits, and backstory had to match the physical characteristics that would be evident in an autopsy. Even his religion was considered. Every factor imaginable had to be used to their advantage. Without such deep measures, Montague and Chumley feared the enemy intelligence officers might doubt the truthfulness of the corpse's identity and therefore the documents he carried. To make their job all the more difficult, they had to communicate all of these factors through the physical items that the corpse would carry, some of which you can see there on the left. Montague and Chumley eventually settled on the Royal Marines as the service branch, due to the necessity of universally sized, rather than specifically tailored, uniform, the measuring for which would have been notably awkward for a specifically tailored one. They selected the rank of major to suit someone who would be trusted to carry important documents. For logistical reasons, they had to use the name of a real Royal Marines officer and selected the name William Martin from a roster. An identity card was drawn up and signed by Montague, lacking only a photograph of William Martin, which we'll get to later. At the same time, Chumley acquired a Royal Marines uniform and, because he was of similar build to the dead man, proceeded to wear the uniform for almost 3 months straight to break it in and make it seem worn. Through the use of letters and other personal effects, Montague and Chumley crafted a personality for their character. These letters, from family and friends, suggested he was an intelligent, dashing character, but somewhat forgetful and impulsive, as evidenced by his identity card, which was marked as a replacement for a lost original. This was a necessary inclusion to explain the shiny new card. A silver cross around his neck signaled him as a Catholic, which they hoped would reduce the chances of a surgical autopsy in the largely Catholic country of Spain, as, at the time, Catholic countries were reluctant to carry out surgical autopsies, especially, or so Montague and Chumley hoped, on fellow Catholics. All this together created a fairly well fleshed out person. Major William Martin of the Royal Marines began to take shape. Despite all the progress they'd made, and the mostly completed character they built, Montague and Chumley still felt one thing was missing from their fictional major. They finally settled on a love life. Major Martin should be engaged. Montague and Chumley asked female secretaries from the office to send in photos of themselves. They selected the photo of Jean Leslie, pictured on the left, to play the part of Pam, Martin's fiancée. They painted the engagement as a typical wartime romance: rushed, poorly planned, and ultimately doomed. To paint this picture, they drew up several love letters from a particularly airheaded fictional fiancée named Pam, as well as a forged receipt for an engagement ring. These items were added to the growing list of pocket detritus the corpse would carry. It is worth noting that while the normal person or the typical soldier would not carry so many identity-revealing items, Montague and Chumley's objective was not to create a normal soldier. The whole point was to create something that the Germans would fall for. And if the identity of William Martin was a little too fleshed out, it did nothing but confirm the Britishness of the corpse as the Germans saw it. This was, as we will later see, very successful. Finally, we come to the most important part of the plan, and the linchpin for the entire operation: the documents Major Martin would carry. Everyone involved in the project, as well as many of their superiors and many members of the 20 Committee, had their own opinion about the letters, and there was a considerable amount of disagreement. Some wanted a detailed plan shared between generals. Others thought that a casual, friendly letter that merely alluded to the invasion of Greece was better, while still others thought a simple, nuts and bolts type of document would work best. Each of these plans had their own merits and shortcomings, but eventually, after much deliberation and many redrafts of the document, they were finally finished. Written from one British general named Archie Nye to another, Harold Alexander, the main letter referred to Operation Husky as a plan to invade the Balkans, and the completely fake Operation Brimstone as an invasion of Sardinia, with Sicily as the cover target for both invasions. Another letter, pictured on the left, was included to explain the reason for the courier. Major Martin was experienced in amphibious operations and would be helpful in planning the coming invasion. In order to contribute to the realism of these documents, the real General Archie Nye was cued in on the plan and agreed to draft the letters himself. After getting approval from American General Eisenhower, who was included because American troops would be affected by the success or failure of the operation, the documents were ready. With documents, pocket litter, and a false identity created, there was one final road bump to get over before the operation was completely ready. Major Martin's identity card needed a photograph. After a less than successful attempt to take pictures of the corpse, Montague began the search for people who looked similar to Glenn or Michael. He found 2 intelligence officers who agreed to be photographed. However, neither of them looked particularly like the corpse. Finally, as the planning for the operation was picking up steam, Montague struck gold with Ronnie Reed, another intelligence officer who, in Montague's words, could have been Martin's twin brother. Reed, pictured on the right, was photographed and 3 identity cards were made, one each with a picture of one of the 3 men who had agreed to be photographed. The time had come for all the different pieces of the deception to come together. Glenn Michael's body, now William Martin, was dressed in a Royal Marines uniform, fitted with his personal effects, and a briefcase was procured. The letters were carefully sealed and photographed so that, upon the document's return, the British might be able to tell if they were tampered with at all. A tiny eyelash was placed in the main letter, which would come into play later on. In the final stages of preparation, the plan had wisely changed from dropping Martin's body out of a plane to floating him ashore from a submarine. To facilitate the transport of such delicate cargo, a military inventor named Charles Fraser Smith devised an airtight metal canister with a double skin designed to keep the body in a cold, oxygen-free environment for its transport to its final destination. You can see the original plans for that canister on the right. All that was required for the operation to begin was the order to go. That order finally came on April 16, 1943. Mincemeat was slated to set sail on April 19th and arrive in the waters outside Huelva, a Spanish port city, on the 28th. In the pre-dawn hours of April 17th, the body was dressed and prepared. Equally early the next morning, the body was loaded into the metal canister and driven from London to Greenock Dock in Scotland in the dark hours before dawn. Adding to the drama of the moment, the driver was the maniacal Jack Horsfall, a British racing driver, in a customized van fitted with a V8 engine, which you can see on the left. After a perilous nighttime journey in blacked-out streets, the body arrived at Greenock Dock and was transported to the depot ship HMS Forth. The next day, the torpedo-shaped canister was loaded onto the submarine HMS Seraph under Lieutenant Norman Jewell, who went by Bill Jewell. The Seraph was an S-class submarine like the one pictured on the left. At 1600 hours on the 19th of April, Montague and Chumley bid Major Martin farewell, and HMS Seraph set sail for the Spanish coast. 10 days of cramped submarine travel, with an increasingly suspicious crew, brought the Seraph to the waters outside of Huelva, a Spanish port town. After their arrival, Bill Jewell waited 1 day for optimal weather conditions and then surfaced in the early hours of April 30. The canister was hauled through the torpedo hatch and then opened by senior crew members. As per his orders, Bill Jewell inspected the corpse's face and chose the identity card with Ronnie Reed's picture on it. The card, bearing the image closest to that of Major Martin, was placed in the corpse's pocket. The briefcase was filled with the documents, attached to Major Martin by a short length of chain, and both were set adrift, buoyed by a small Air Force life jacket. The submarine then withdrew from the coast and made a second stop to drop an inflatable dinghy and oar as evidence of a plane crash. Finally, stopping some 12 miles out from the coast, the Seraph surfaced and unloaded the canister. Their orders were to sink the device, but due to the double-skin construction of the canister, it refused to do so, even when it was shot full of bullet holes. It finally sank only after being blown to bits by plastic explosives. Later that same morning, a local fish spotter named Jose Antonio Rey Maria spotted something that was most definitely not a sardine. He rowed his small skiff to the anomaly and found a corpse floating on the waters. Everyone else refused to touch the corpse, so Ray Maria used his small skiff to haul Major Martin's body to shore. Ray Maria called local soldiers to look at the body, and it was soon taken to the nearby town of Huelva. Spanish Naval Lieutenant Pascual del Pobil ordered an autopsy, with British Vice-Consul Francis Hazelden in attendance. The reason for a vice-consul was that both Britain and Germany had small ethnic communities near Huelva, and each had a consul and vice-consul involved in the affairs of the town. It was at this point, during the autopsy, that two oversights in the plan presented themselves. The first was extremely unexpected and nearly ended the deception. The Spanish lieutenant Pascual del Pobil offered Vice-Consul Hazelden the briefcase containing the documents. While this was an innocent, kind-hearted move, accepting would have ruined the entire operation. Fortunately, Hazelden had been clued in on the plan and managed to casually deflect the offer without arousing suspicion. Secondly, and equally worrying, the doctor in charge of the autopsy, Dr. Eduardo Fernandez del Torno, had some doubts. Despite what Britain's pathologist, Bernard Spilsbury, had said, del Torno, a Spanish pathologist, was quite capable and noticed some signs inconsistent with drowning, like lack of small sea creature bites and dissolving clothing. Hazelden again rectified the situation by assuring the doctor that he was satisfied with a limited autopsy. Reassured by this, and no doubt motivated by the terrible smell involved with the autopsy, Fernandez overlooked his doubts and filed an official report that Martin had drowned some 8 to 10 days earlier. Finally, almost 5 months after Glenroy Michael's death, on May 2nd, 1943, he was buried and given a funeral, as William Martin. A surprising amount of people arrived at Major Martin's funeral, certainly more than would have come to Glenroy Michael's. A small crowd of curious civilians attended, as well as Hazelden, several Spanish port officials, Spanish military officers, and the German vice-consul and spy, Adolf Klaus. To ensure no one would dig up the corpse and somehow unmask the deception, a huge slab of marble, as you can see on the right, was placed as a gravestone, commemorating Major William Martin. Long after, once Mincemeat was declassified in 1997, the gravestone was amended to honor the real Glenroy Michael as well as the fictitious Major Martin, a picture of which you can see later on in the presentation. While Mincemeat had gone off successfully up to that point, further difficulties were to arise. Rumors quickly spread about the briefcase that had washed ashore with the drowned corpse, and the German high command was interested. The German vice-consul and spy, Adolf Klaus, gave numerous bribes and made inquiries about the documents. However, the Spanish Navy proved itself much more neutral than much of the other de facto cooperation from other parts of the Spanish military and government, withholding the briefcase and documents it contained. As Montague and Cholmondeley received news of this, they did their best to intervene, sending messages set to fall into German hands that would stir the pot and make the documents seem all the more valuable. Finally, Spanish intelligence gave orders to a lieutenant colonel named Suarez to retrieve the briefcase. He did so, and the documents were passed to a small group of Spanish intelligence officers. These intelligence officers managed to slightly open the back of the envelopes and twist the paper around a thin metal rod, removing the letters without breaking the seals on the envelopes. After the letters had been allowed to dry, the German intelligence officers were allowed 1 hour with the documents. An officer named Leisner realized the document's importance and made photocopies, which were sent up the German chain of command. On May 11th, 1943, the briefcase and Major Martin's personal effects were returned to the British Embassy. They were immediately packaged and sent to Britain, through the Air Force mail service. After a few tense days when the package appeared to get lost in the mail, it arrived, and the letters were carefully examined by British intelligence officers. The seals and outside of the envelopes appeared identical to the photographs they had taken before deployment. However, upon opening the letters, they not only found that the carefully placed eyelash was missing, but that the letters showed evidence of being folded and unfolded while wet. Crucially, the letters also curled when dried, evidencing the Spanish intelligence officers' method of removal. On or around May 9th, the letters finally landed on Hitler's desk, where they were always meant to end up. The effects of the documents was even more potent than the Allies had hoped. On May 12th, Hitler issued a military directive that placed the defense of Greece as the highest priority in the Mediterranean. He even attempted to convince Mussolini that Sicily was not a likely target. The ruse's incredible success was, in part, because of Hitler's pre-existing mindset. At this point in the war, Hitler largely distrusted his generals and staff, who he thought were failing and lying to him as the tide of the war turned against Nazi Germany and her Axis allies. As his untrusted staff advised him that Sicily was a prime target, Hitler was more inclined to believe that the attack would fall elsewhere. As such, the Mincemeat documents confirmed what Hitler already suspected and gave him a false sense of invincibility and confidence. With this ungrounded confidence, Hitler diverted sizable amounts of German ground and sea forces from Italy to the Balkans. Greece was reinforced and prepared for invasion, while other places were left stretched dangerously thin. Specifically, German and Italian forces on Sicily received fewer supplies than they needed. With Hitler making these unwitting contributions to the Allied battle plan, the Allies prepared for their invasion. On July 10, 1943, Bill Jewell, aboard the HMS Seraph, the same captain and submarine that had transported Major Martin, dropped a marker buoy to guide the Allied invasion force into the beaches on the southern coast of Sicily. You can see on the map the landing sites along the bottom, as well as the smaller symbols that show where paratroopers were dropped, some successfully, others not so fortunate. All this taken together showed the invasion of Sicily had begun. At that point in 1943, almost a year before the invasion of Normandy, the invasion of Sicily was the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever known. You can see a picture there of tanks rolling ashore in the assault force. This first major assault was successful, facing a limited enemy force and managing to establish a firm beachhead, which they held through a fierce, but ultimately unsuccessful, German counterattack. Over the course of the next month, fighting raged across the island, with the Germans in a steady retreat as many Italian forces surrendered around them. On the 17th of August, the last of the German and Italian forces pulled off the island, retreating to the Italian peninsula. Overall, the invasion of Sicily, and later the whole campaign in Italy, was a messy, costly affair, with Italy proving itself to be far from the soft underbelly that Churchill claimed it would be. However, it is hard to deny the effects of the mincemeat deception. Allied casualty projections for the first week of the invasion were at 10,000 men dead, while in reality, only 1/7 of that number were killed or wounded in the first week. Naval losses had been projected at 300 ships in the first week, but only 12 naval craft were sunk in that time. Without Operation Mincemeat's successful deception, these numbers could and would have been much higher. So, as the mincemeat story played out, let's see how the people who had masterminded the operation got on. Ewan Montague, the naval representative, continued to work in MI5 until the end of the war, when he returned to the law system, becoming a lawyer of considerable renown. He lived out his days in public spotlight, especially after writing a partially true account of Operation Mincemeat, which omitted several key details, including Glyndwr Michael, the corpse's identity. Charles Cholmondeley's fate could not have been more different than Montague's. After the war, Cholmondeley worked for the British government, hunting locusts in the Middle East, often in full Bedouin costume, a picture of which you can see on the left. After several years in the Middle East, he returned to Britain, settled down in a quiet neighborhood, and sold lawnmowers until his retirement. As for Glyndwr Michael, the man who was the most important to Operation Mincemeat, his name was kept secret for many years from the public, until 1997, when the operation was declassified. Overall, Operation Mincemeat left a lasting, if unorthodox, legacy. It undeniably reduced casualties for both U.S. and British troops in what was, overall, a messy campaign in the invasion of Sicily. It also became an iconic World War II story, inspiring several novels and films that portrayed the events of the deception to varying degrees of accuracy. It also became an important event in the international intelligence community, a warning against the "too good to be true" and a reminder that the best deceptions confirm suspicions which are already there. In conclusion, Operation Mincemeat began as an odd idea from the equally odd mind of Charles Cholmondeley. Like many intelligence operations, it was carried out to an extreme degree of complexity and nuance, thanks to a small group of very dedicated people. The operation successfully deceived the Axis powers and saved lives during a time when many were lost, leaving an honorable legacy despite its unorthodox, and some would say dishonorable, methods. All this was accomplished thanks to a destitute man from Wales named Glyndwr Michael, who finally received recognition only after many years. I drew my information for this project primarily from Ben McIntyre's Operation Mincemeat and Dennis Smythe's Deathly Deception. These two historical accounts of the deception supplied a large amount of information and detail about a somewhat obscure topic. I also used the MCC resources to find articles such as Fitzgerald's Eagles over Husky and Lindsay's Military Strategy, Private Invasion, and War. These articles, as well as Moore's A Short Primer on Deception and What to Do About It, and Kiley's Writing the War, served to supply additional information about how Operation Mincemeat fit into the larger context of the war and history as a whole. I drew my images from various organizations like the Imperial War Museum, National World War II Museum of New Orleans, and World History Encyclopedia, as well as images taken from McIntyre and Smith's respective books. Thank you for your time in viewing this presentation. I hope you learned something from the complex, macabre, and very nuanced details of an intelligence operation called Operation Mincemeat.